So welcome. We are going to get started. This is the Housing Rights Advisory Committee for November 2024. We have some members joining remotely online, so welcome to all of them and to those of you who are here with us. My name is Elizabeth McIsaac. I'm the chair of this committee. The clerk has confirmed that we have quorum, and so I'd like to call meeting 4 of the Housing Rights Advisory Committee to order. Welcome, everyone. This meeting is being held with committee members and staff participating both by video conference and in person in City Hall Committee Room number 2. Members of the public may also attend in person or observe the meeting on YouTube. I ask everyone for their patience today with any delays or technical issues as we work through the meeting. For a few reminders, staff, please keep your video turned off unless you are speaking or answering questions. Members and staff, please keep your microphones muted unless you need to answer a question or speak. And members, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand, unmute your mic, and let me know. So I will be keeping an eye both on the screen and also in the room. And if I don't notice you, please don't hesitate to draw my attention actively. I also remind members that if you have any motions on any of the agenda items, they must be submitted in writing and can be emailed to the committee secretary at hrac@toronto.ca. So, as we begin, and although we are in different locations and some of us are meeting remotely today, the committee would like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This is an important land acknowledgement because the work of this committee is focused on those whose housing rights are at risk or are being violated. And what we know is that Indigenous peoples in our city are some of the most precariously situated. And so it's important to be mindful of the colonial history that is part of this reality. So, moving on to the business of today, the first item is that well, it's not an item, but can we please have a motion to confirm the minutes from our meeting on September 23rd, 2024? And so I'm looking for someone to move. Thank you. Bahar Shadpur. And all those in favor, if I could please see your hands going up. Thank you. And on the screen, I see hands going up. Thank you very much. Gord, are you in favor? Thank you. And carried. Wonderful. I would like to draw your attention at this point to one new agenda item which we will need to vote on in order to introduce it to the agenda. I have submitted a letter with a recommendation that the board board or committee rather, that the committee introduce and consider a presentation from Leilani Farha, who is the global director of the SHIFT. She is also the former UN rapporteur on adequate housing, and I want to include this as the first item for today. I have invited Leilani to join us to speak to us, and this is part of, as we reflect back on our very first meeting and talking about the importance of us deepening our understanding of what housing as a human right means and how we can apply that to the city and provide our advice in the best possible way. And so I have taken the liberty of inviting Leilani to join us to talk to us about applying a human rights-based approach to housing and identifying human rights outcomes that municipalities can work toward. I think that Leilani is possibly one of the best positioned people in this country to give us that advice and to walk us through some ideas around that, and she has agreed to be available. So I need to first check if there are any questions or discussion about my introduction of this item. And seeing none, I would ask for all of those who are in favor of introducing this item to please raise their hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Terrific. Then that carries, and now this is part of today's agenda, and I would like to proceed with this as the first item. I believe Leilani is online. And so I would ask her to turn her camera on at this point. There you are. Hi, Leilani. Welcome. So I was just doing a bit of an introduction. Given the fact that you have done some of the bulk of the interpretation of the international guidelines on housing as a human right during your tenure as the rapporteur, and continue to work with cities, not only in Canada, but in other parts of the world, around what it means to realize the right to housing in cities. I thought you would be best positioned, and you have agreed to join us, so thank you. Over to you, and I think about 15 minutes would be terrific, and then we will have an opportunity for the committee to ask you questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me in to your space, your committee. I should say I am here in Ottawa. I am but a guest, a non-colonial guest on the Anishinaabe-Algonquin territory. I want to say at the outset that what you're doing in this committee is so very important. And you know, it may not feel like it because you meet periodically and change is slow, but you are part of the new human rights infrastructure within the city. And that in and of itself is pretty amazing. It's taken decades for us to get into the housing crisis that we're in. It's going to take us a long time to get out, but I am convinced that city-based human rights infrastructure, like such committees, is absolutely part of the solution. So just a big kudos to you for having this committee created and for attending it. I want to start, one of the things, I love talking about human rights, so I'm super happy to be here. And this is my comfort zone. So this is how I prefer to exist. And I'm going to try to convey to you how simple and kind of ordinary human rights are, because there's something intimidating I've noticed for non-lawyers especially to talk about human rights. It's like, oh gosh, human rights law, and who am I to engage in human rights law when I'm not a lawyer? But I want you to not be afraid of human rights, and I want you to understand that in fact, we all do have a deep, visceral understanding of human rights, because human rights are about preserving our humanity, and they were simply designed to ensure that we would all have the best human experience we can have while we're on these lands. I remind you, human rights are not earned. Human rights attach to us simply because we are human. And that's it. They are understood as universally applicable. So one's housing status, whether you have housing, whether you don't have housing, whether you're living in social housing, whether you own a home, that has no bearing on whether or not we have human rights. And I like to think of human rights as a way to do policy. If they provide you with the substance that you need to craft good policies or to react to policies, but they also provide you with a methodology. And that's what I'm going to try to convey to you today. The way I look at human rights is in relation to policy is that they offer sort of three pathways or tranches. I would say human rights provide standards for housing, like they indicate to us what is adequate housing and what is inadequate housing. That's the first tranche, so sort of the substantive element of human rights. Then there's the expenditure of resources. Human rights has something to say about how resources are spent, what they're spent on, how many resources are spent. And then the third tranche is process, because human rights actually offers us a process. And so I'm going to take you through those three tranches and some of the areas that your working groups within the committee are focused on. But before I do that, I just want to say one more thing, which is that let us remember that human rights are different than doing charity or than being altruistic. Yeah. Because human rights are based in law and they impose on governments obligations. And that's different than charity or altruism. There isn't actually some, obligation to be charitable, but there is an obligation to implement the right to housing on the part of governments and, in fact, private actors who are engaged in the area of housing. So I hope that when you think about human rights, you think about them differently than charity and altruism, and that they give you the strength to be, or it gives you the kind of courage to be quite strong in your application, because what you're trying to do in your committee is to hold the government, the City of Toronto, accountable to their human rights obligations. And so this isn't about being kind of nice. This is about the implementation of law and compelling a government to meet its obligations. And so I want you to carry with you that distinction and draw strength from it. And then the last thing I'll say in this regard is that when I'm working with cities, I always try to get cities to understand that human rights aren't this kind of stick that cities should be beaten down with, like you're bad, you're not meeting your obligations. It's the opposite. Human rights are carrots. They offer cities standards, direction, outcomes, goals, and ultimately, if implemented, they create better cities, right? Literally, human rights make people happier. If you're enjoying the full panoply of human rights, you are a happier person. You are a more stable person. You are calmer. You're likely to have less anxiety and stress. That makes for better cities, because then people who are calm and happy and decently employed and have enough money to live can contribute back to the city, can give more to the city, can attend community meetings, can think big, can have a vision, can help implement other aspects of good city living. Okay, so let me now take you to a set of questions that I always ask myself when I'm faced with a lack of policy or with policy or programs that I'm wondering, hey, wait, how does this fit in with this big human rights framework with the human right to housing? And I can make this available to people in written form if that's useful. I think this is being, I don't know, videotaped or whatever the word is, recorded, and you can look back to this for reference. And I also always offer myself as a resource to you at any time. But here are the set of questions, and there's 7 that I tend to think about that should help orient your work. The very first thing I do when I come across a policy or a program or a situation, a live incident, for example, I ask myself, is this an area that international law has provided guidance on, that someone in the international human rights community has written a report about or talked about, including myself, but there are many others who have contributed to this big body of work. And, I'll take, for example, I know you're working on Renovictions, for example. Well, there is a big body of international law out there that talks about displacement and development-based displacement and forced evictions. That is all very relevant. Oh, there's a big body of work on security of tenure. My predecessor did secure tenure guidelines. That big body of work is your tool, it's your resources, and you should avail yourselves of them. Most of us who've written guidelines try to write them in an easy to use format, easily applied format. So go and check out what's available to you so you're not reinventing the wheel. I always ask myself on the process side, how was this policy reached? Was it a human rights process? Did it meaningfully engage the affected group? Or was it a bunch of people sitting at City Hall writing this kind of in the abstract? Was it based on academic literature versus practical application? Was lived expertise part of this process? The third question I ask is, will the policy be implemented in a human rights compliant way? For example, while it's being implemented, will it have accountability mechanisms built in and monitoring mechanisms so that as it's implemented, we can be assured that it's reaching its intended human rights outcome or goal? Will those most affected have a way to complain if things aren't going well? The fourth question, who might get left behind by this policy? And I've seen in your working groups, you're already asking that question. That's a really important question. Who is excluded from this? Who needs to be included? The fifth question, a really obvious one. Does the policy violate the right to housing? Is there something about this policy that creates more housing precarity, denies people access to housing, creates or contributes to homelessness? Those are important questions to ask. And almost any policy, excuse me, at city level could have a bearing on housing. You know, you think about parking infractions. There might be bylaws that make it illegal, or you'll get ticketed or fined if you park overnight. Well, think about the implications of that for someone living in a car, right? So who is affected by this, and how are they affected, and how is their human right to housing affected? And then on the flip of that, does the policy actually achieve or move us toward a human rights outcome? So not just is it violative, but does it actually move us forward? Or is this just kind of status quo? You want to have policies and programs that actually move forward the right to housing. The progressive realization of the right to housing is what we're looking for. And lastly, my seventh question, are adequate resources attributed to the policy or program in light of the available resources to the city and other expenditures? So, for example, I mean, homelessness is an egregious violation of the right to housing. We know this. There's no other way of looking at homelessness. That's simply a violation of the right to housing. And so you might look at resource expenditure on homelessness at city level versus police expenditure, for example. Are they weighted appropriately? Okay. So I have about 4 minutes left, and what I want to do is just take you to a couple of your working groups and try to tease out what we might be looking at in terms of human rights outcomes using those three tranches. And I may only have time to deal with one, but then perhaps we can, if you have questions, we can deal with some of the other working groups. I think what I'll do is I'll look at supporting the unhoused, the working group regarding supporting the unhoused. There's obviously a really big human rights outcome you're looking at with respect to people who are unhoused. And it's so obvious, right? Which is every single person who is unhoused or living in homelessness should have secure, long-term, affordable housing that's appropriate to their needs in terms of supports and location and the actual built environment, right? That's the big human rights outcome. And then the second one related to homelessness would be that no one falls into homelessness, right? Because you obviously want to prevent that. And that if anyone does, excuse me, fall into homelessness, that it's brief and non-recurring. Okay, those are your big human rights outcomes. Now, those are long-term outcomes, let's face it. You're not going to achieve that within the next year, for example. So then you want to start looking, okay, well, what are my shorter term, more achievable, low-hanging fruit outcomes that are human rights outcomes and that put me on, or put the city on the path towards meeting that big outcome, right? And so in terms of process, you might want to look at, does the city meaningfully engage people with lived expertise of homelessness, of living in encampments, of living in shelters, of couch surfing, of living in cars and vehicles, right? is that population being accessed as policies and programs are being developed and as they're being implemented, right? It's not just the development phase, it's the implementation phase to make sure that these policies are actually meeting needs. Then you might look at resources, and in terms of outcomes for resources, what budgetary allocations are being made? Can you move that budget? Can you make recommendations that increase that budget or that better target existing budgets? It's not always about more money. Sometimes it's about a better targeting of those monies. So insofar as there's a pot of money for homelessness, is it moving? Is it being attributed in the right places? For example, are too many resources going to support a shelter system that actually should be eventually dismantled, right? We don't want people living long-term in shelters. And a human rights outcome would be that shelters are available for people who need them on an emergency basis because homelessness is short-lived and non-recurring, right? And so you might be asking, okay, well, is there something we could be doing with resources so that we can start shaping the shelter system? In terms of other outcomes, I mean, there can be any number, but let's look at shelter system reform. Yes, you want to move the city toward better conditions within shelters so that they're human rights compliant. But again, you want to make sure that you're also keeping your eye on structural reform. And that's what I was talking about just a few seconds ago. Are we understanding that the shelter system is performing a role it shouldn't be? How can we influence policy to change that? And then that might get you to start looking at, okay, is enough attention being paid to the entry points to homelessness? For example, we know Statistics Canada and CMHC have put out reports that show us the entry points to homelessness. We know people transitioning from foster care. It's one of the most significant contributors to homelessness, right? We know that's a structural entry point. We know social assistance rates are too low. That's a structural entry point. We know that exiting from prisons and long-term hospital stays are entry points. So is there something that we can be doing to ensure that we're addressing those entry points? And then we might see, fewer people falling into homelessness, and that would be a human rights outcome. So I'm at my time now, so I'm going to stop here. I had plenty more to say, as you can well imagine. As I said, one of my favorite topics, but I'll pass it back to your chair, Elizabeth, and I'm open to any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leilani. And so I would like to open it to our committee. I'm just taking a look at those who are joining us remotely and those in the room. Thank you for a really great overview of what it means for us to do our work, the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about, and I think it begins to give us a good discipline around how we think about the issues that we're trying to work with. I'm going to open it up to my committee members if people have questions for you. Yes, Sarota.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Leilani. That was great, super helpful. Your point about does this policy violate the right to housing really struck me. Thinking about, is there something about the policy that creates more housing precarity and contributes to homelessness? I think, yeah, our working group, which is the Maintaining Housing Working Group, have been sort of talking about two things. We're really interested in the risks that might be involved when it comes to implementing the Renovictions bylaw and having that applied to the multi-tenant homes framework. And we really want to prioritize maintaining those deeply affordable housing units that are on the private housing market. So for me, that was just a great framing for us to continue exploring in a deeper way as these two frameworks roll out, and as we we want to. I think for us, for our working group, we want the city to do its best to continue monitoring it and ensuring that it's complying with the human rights to housing. So for me, that was really helpful. I don't have a question, but thank you so much.
I'm glad you raised that. Elizabeth, am I okay to respond, or did you want to collect questions?
Go ahead.
Jeff? Okay. I just wanted to say that I'm super happy you're working on this maintenance issue. In light of the size, depth of the housing crisis in Toronto and actually across the country, it's actually unacceptable that we lose one affordable unit, let alone the thousands that we're losing at the rapid clip that we're losing them. And so your work in this regard is super important. I want to add one thing to process. We often talk about, and I did in my presentation, we must include those most affected in the process. But I really am wanting to encourage the inclusion of the dominant landlord actors, whether they're corporations or like big financial institutions, or whether they're smaller. It doesn't matter. Both have to be involved as co-responsible for the crisis and co-responsible for the solution, the real solution and the human rights solution. And I would be looking to the city to see, are they engaging these actors in a meaningful human rights conversation? A meaningful human rights conversation. And I would be looking at the city, if I were you and across your working groups, I would be looking at the city's budget and how much of public resources are supporting private landlords, and what are they getting in return for that support. You see, so public resources always go, there's a whole range of them, always go to private developers, from waiving of property taxes, for example, to even less obvious things like the provision of roads and water and sewage to new developments. Those are all public resources supporting private development. So then, and I'm not saying that's bad necessarily. What I'm saying is, what is the human rights return on those public expenditures? That's a question you should be asking yourselves.
That's a great reframe. Thank you. Harmy.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. I have two questions, but I would appreciate if they're too long to answer, or we don't have time, so let me know. My first question is, I appreciated your point around accountability and transparency. I think they're key when it comes to any meaningful change, and you keep using that word, and that's what really, I pay a lot of attention to that word all the time, right? And in your opinion, could you tell us a little bit about what are the international legal venues to ensure Canada meets its obligations? So that's the first question. I don't know if you want me to.
Maybe, well, Elizabeth, I leave it to you. Both questions
Why
or
don't
one
you
question?
give us both questions, and then
Okay.
Donna can deal with both.
Sure. And then the second question is, in your experience and in your opinion, what is the country that has best responded to homelessness? I mean, I think that you spoke about it in a way in terms of the different factors that we should consider to a proper response to a complex issue like homelessness. But in your opinion, do you have any example of a country that has responded appropriately and that you have seen important results as to how they address it?
Sure. Thank you for those questions. The first one on international legal venues to hold Canada accountable. Let's be real. the international legal order is in disarray right now. And I say that because of what's happening in Sudan, in Palestine, in particularly in Gaza, but also the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Congo. There is a kind of impunity going on that is deeply troubling. And so as someone who was an international mechanism myself, it pains me to say what I'm saying here. But I am worried about the efficacy of the international legal system at the moment in terms of holding any government accountable. I'll say that. There are committees that are set up to review governments' compliance with international human rights law. The most relevant one for us today would be the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There are other committees. There is one that deals with disability rights and women's rights and children's rights, all separate committees. So those would all be relevant. There is a convening of Indigenous peoples that happen as well that would be relevant. So there are those mechanisms. One of the things that I like about Canada right now, and there aren't many things. I'm struggling in this country right now. I'm being honest here. But one of the things I like is that there is this human rights architecture and infrastructure that's being built. It is in its infancy. So we have a federal housing advocate. She's new to the job and she's working out her ways, but she's becoming increasingly effective, in my opinion. You all have in Toronto this committee, which is amazing. You have a new ombuds or deputy ombuds, whatever, responsible for housing. So it's all early days, and I really think we need to put a lot of energy into our domestic mechanisms. That's what I would say. In terms of countries doing well, Finland is always the go-to. But they are now headed by a more right-leaning government, and they are. I actually I sat down and had a coffee with one of the leading implementers of their Housing First program, which is a genuine and true and robust Housing First program, unlike anything in Canada. So don't kid yourself when you hear, "Oh, we're doing Housing First." It is not comparable to what's being done in Finland. But he was expressing real concern about this government because they want to lower social assistance rates. That was one of the key changes that their Housing First program made that really started ensuring they were able to address people falling into homelessness. And so he's expecting another uptick in homelessness, and it will be a zero-sum game again, which is not what we want, right? Where you're solving homelessness with your left hand and and I use this on purpose, solving homelessness with your left hand and creating homelessness with your right hand. Denmark is another country that's doing fairly well. Generally, the European countries, even when they're right-wing, they're not quite as right as what we see in the United States, for example, and potentially here in Canada. So, but those would be the two kind of leading countries.
Thank you. Bahar, you had a question. I just want to take a quick look at the other committee members because I'm conscious of time. So we've got a question from Bahar. Does anyone online have a question so I can tee it up? We're good online. Okay, so I'll just turn to Bahar and that'll be the last question and then back to Leilani. Oh, sorry, Anne-Marie. So Bahar and then Anne-Marie and then Leilani. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Leilani, for your presentation and making this accessible to understand how human rights can be applied practically. I really appreciated what you shared in terms of process and then kind of attaching that to human rights outcomes. And as part of the working group number 4, which we're looking at increasing affordable housing supply, we had a little bit of a lot of back and forth in terms of like, what do we focus on? There's so many issues that are important, but we have very little time, and we want to be effective in the year and how many months we have left as part of this HRAC committee. So hoping to get a bit more from you in terms of how do we focus on, when we say issues, people most impacted by housing affordability, adequacy issues. How do you have any, helpful tips in terms of focusing our thinking and also being, realistic and practical about the outcomes that we can achieve in the next year, while queuing it up, hopefully, for longer term impact?
I did look at your housing supply working group, and in fact, it was one of the areas I had wanted to talk about. I think you're right. It's probably one of the more complicated areas when you're looking at affordable supply. I guess one of my apologies, I just don't know enough about where you're at with the working group, and I don't know enough about the city of Toronto. So apologies for my ignorance, but I would want to ensure that you have a very human rights definition of affordability, distinguishing between social housing and affordable housing, but recognizing that social housing would be the most affordable housing, and some people will need social housing, and then a real definition of affordable housing that's in keeping with human rights, which has nothing to do with market values at all, and just and separating it off. And believe it or not, the definition in international law of affordability is different than you might think. It isn't actually 30% of your income. It is, it's sort of more creative. It's that at the end of the month or at the beginning of the month, after you pay your rent or your housing costs, you have enough money for other basic necessities: food, medicines, transportation, these days, internet, et cetera. So, that's the definition. And so you want to make sure that you have a strong definition. The other thing I would say that I think I already touched on around supply and affordable supply is, do you have a sense of all of the different types of affordable models that are out there? That you can offer the city, and things like not just social housing, but community land trust, cooperative housing, et cetera, that you've identified all of those different models that are out there. There are lots of different tenure forms. One of my predecessors wrote a report about the different tenure forms that are out there that governments never talk about and never avail themselves of or don't try to promote. Trying to think what else. I also maintain that that the city must be in conversation with the private actors. I do not understand why governments are not more proactive in engaging the private actors as part of the solution for genuinely affordable housing. Those assets exist. So when I'm looking around and I'm thinking, how am I going to create more social housing in my city? I'm looking at what available assets are there, because building takes so long, right? And so we need to figure out, what do we have available that could be harnessed for affordable assets? And part of that's going to be any unit that comes free in a multifamily apartment complex, right? Any unit that comes free could become a social housing unit, could become a deeply affordable housing unit. But that would require governments to engage the profit-seeking landlords in a conversation about how to make that happen over time. I also think, and I'll leave it here, I know I'm talking too long, that cities need to do audits of available assets that could be harnessed. And that's a resource issue. That's that human rights resource. So cities have to use the maximum of their available resources to move forward the right to housing, the progressive realization of the right to housing. So then you have to say, okay, well, the city should do an audit of all available assets. And what are the available assets? It could be abandoned land and properties. It could be underutilized land and properties. It could be short-term lets. It could be underutilized or decrepit social housing units that need to be refurbished or retrofitted, etc. That audit should happen because I think there's always assets available that cities don't always know about, and I think the city would be. I certainly think Abby Bond in the city would be happy for such a thing to happen if it hasn't already. And again, forgive my ignorance if such an audit exists.
Thank you, Leilani. And Anne Marie. Do it again?
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Anne Marie. I'm actually the co-chair for this committee, but I work on the working group, so I'm happy to be here in person. Most of you haven't met me. Leila, hello. Thank you for being part of this conversation. I'm aware of some of the work that you do, so it's a privilege to be in this space with you. I think there are like two things that I wanted to bring forward from what you just shared, but then I have a question at the end. I'll make this very quick. Thank you for sharing the methodology around the trenches, the pathways to consider, especially around what is adequate versus what is not inadequate. Thank you also for talking about resources. I believe that we not only live in a rich country, but Canada is one out of, if not one, the wealthiest, but at least out of the three countries that we know have the money, Canada is one of them. So resources should not be a problem. It's how are we spending tax dollars and what are we doing with tax dollars to help to make sure that we're solving social problems. So thank you for bringing that up as one of the pathways to this conversation. But also the other thing is you talk about process, and I'm glad that the conversation is moving towards that, because I think if we're going to solve problem of homelessness in this country, in this city, we have to start at the process level. So thank you for bringing that forward. The other thing I really leaned into when you were talking about is that housing right has nothing to do with charity. This is not like we're doing people a service. Like, it's a right. It's like you're breathing. It is a right. It's a basic human right. None of us are altruistic for doing the work that we're doing. I'm sitting here because I believe housing is a human right. If I have the right to be in a place that is warm, that is safe, that is secure, you have that right. And the person outside, sitting outside City Hall right now on the asphalt has that right too. So we have to start looking at things from a holistic perspective as to what is humane versus what is privileged. It is not privileged to be in a place called home. It's a human right. And we need to look at it from all government levels, that people need to be housed regardless of what their struggles are. They need to be housed, and we need to start taking that seriously. My question then to you would be, how can we implement or start having more of a robust conversation like Finland in what they do in adopting the housing rights approach, which started in New York City, by the way. They just didn't do anything about it. Someone else picked up, their stuff and is doing well with it. How can we lean into that and start tackling homelessness on that level?
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for those really important comments. And I just want to say on the resource front, Elizabeth over the weekend brought to my attention that the province of Ontario has a spare $3 billion that Premier Ford is using, at least in part, to cut checks to all of us for $200 or something like that. I mean, it is absolutely obscene in light of the dire housing crisis in this province. I mean, it is I would say he's in violation of the right to housing and other socioeconomic rights. Our healthcare system is also in crisis, and that's not an appropriate expenditure of $3 billion that could go some distance in really making improving human well-being. In terms of trying to, go the Finland way or creating a more robust approach in this country, well, I think a lot of us are trying, and I think at the city level, you need to be insisting on here's what I think, human rights, housing first, health rights, Indigenous rights, model to address homelessness. And I've actually been working with a few partners at the national level to kind of develop that model, including the person who rolled out Housing First in New York way back when, the inventor of Housing First, but joining with those who understand Indigenous rights in the homelessness context, as well as health rights in the homelessness context, Dr. Buzari. We are offering this model to the federal government. They just haven't taken a bite. But you at the local level should be demanding this also of your city, that we know that Housing First, if it's based in a human rights framework and includes Indigenous and health rights, we know it's effective. And so we just have to keep insisting and demanding. And what I learned from my Finnish colleagues is that you really need the housing first. So it's not good enough for governments to embrace housing first if there's no housing. And so there has to be a concomitant or parallel commitment to figuring out where that housing is. And that's why I say that audit is so important of existing assets and engaging existing landlords in the equation, because we need these units for people, right? And then we also need the social supports that some, not all, some households will need. So I can only say, Anne Marie, let's keep talking about it and putting it forward and demanding a real response to homelessness and housing precarity, and really, drawing attention to this Housing First human rights model.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Leilani. Thank you, Anne Marie. Thank you, everyone. I have one final question for you, Leilani. There's lots happening around housing rights right now that's very urgent. You and I have also spoken about some of the concerns about encampments, clearing encampments, and a more recent narrative in Ontario among cities about invoking the notwithstanding clause in order to clear encampments. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of what is at stake in terms of human rights and some of that development.
Thanks for the question, Elizabeth. And I will say, after this call, I'm running to go and address that very issue. I am completely distraught, as are others, about what's happening in the province of Ontario in particular, but not exclusively. Some of you may have read over the weekend, if not before, that 13 mayors across the province of Ontario have written a letter to Premier Ford at Premier Ford's urging. The letter asks the Premier to do several things which are deeply alarming. The first thing is they are asking the Premier to use Article 33 of the Charter, which is called the Notwithstanding Clause, to override charter protections. And not just to override any old charter protections, but to override the protection of the right to life, security of the person, and security of the person in the charter. And the way they want the Premier to do that is threefold, I'd say. One, they want the Premier to intervene in any cases that come forward trying to prevent the forced eviction of encampments, to use the notwithstanding clause. So the courts have said, if you clear an encampment, they said this in Waterloo, if you clear an encampment and people have no appropriate place to go, that is a violation of Section 7 of the Charter, the right to life and security of the person. That is a fundamental and core right. There are two fundamental rights in the international human rights system, the right to life and the right to housing, and they coexist. And I'm not making this up. This is the way it is. These are core rights. And the mayors want Premier Ford to override Section 7 of the Charter and deny homeless people the right to to life and security of the person. They also want the Premier to enact legislation that would enable the involuntary institutionalization of people who are presumed to have addictions. And that is a violation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's a major international treaty that Canada has ratified to protect persons with disabilities. The involuntary institutionalization of persons with disabilities, and addiction is considered a disability, is a violation of human rights. And thirdly, they want the Premier to allow them to incarcerate, through criminal law, incarcerate people who trespass on a multiple basis. So in other words, people who set up a tent more than once in a park, on public property, in a parking lot, to incarcerate them, denying them liberty and security. So this letter has gone to Premier Ford at Premier Ford's behest. I mean, he really put that out there in the public domain. Mayors, why don't you come and ask me to do this? So they have. And apparently more and more mayors are sort of glomming on to this letter. I don't know if that's actually true, but this destabilizes human rights, and human rights for the most disadvantaged people in our country. It undermines the power of human rights. It undermines human rights, period. So many of us are looking to Mayor Chow to say something about this, to do something. And if your committee could contribute to that, you would be on the right side of history. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you, Leilani. I agree. I think this is something of great urgency, and it's a narrative we need to sort of grab and stop in its tracks. I do think that the City of Toronto is making the right moves in terms of progressively realizing the right to housing as per our Toronto Charter on housing, which invokes the National Housing Strategy Act, which invokes the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And so I think that we have the right framework there, and I think it's just important that we strengthen that and encourage and send that message. Harmy, did you?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to make a motion to introduce an item.
Okay,
Is this
so
at
I
the
think the
time?
clerks are going to help us crafting that motion. So what's the word I use? We're going to hold it down and come back to it when we have a motion ready with the proper language.
Oh, okay.
But the motion will be in the spirit of forwarding a letter to the mayor that articulates our concerns as it relates to this. So we will come back to that before the meeting is over.
Okay.
The clerks are just helping with a drafting of what that would look like.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Harmy. And with that, we are going to move back. I want to first say thank you to Leilani for taking the time to join us. You have given us lots and lots to think about, very relevant to the work that we have in front of us. And so I appreciate your taking the time and a thoughtful consideration of the work that we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so we will return now to our regularly scheduled agenda. And I would now move to item H41, resignation of a member from the Housing Rights Advisory Committee. I think we mentioned this last time, but we have a letter attached from the city clerk indicating that the city clerk's office received a notice that Dr. Daniel Raza resigned from the Housing Rights Advisory Committee effective September 23rd, 2024. I understand we have a speaker on this item. Who is that? My speakers list is here. Carrie Ann Thomas. Is Carrie Ann here in person or online? Neither. So we will move forward. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. So if there are no recommendations on this letter, may I have a motion to receive the item for information? Thank you, Harmy. All in favor, can I see a show of hands, please? Looking online. Thank you very much, and carried. Wonderful. Moving on to item 4.2, supporting unhoused rights holders working group, chair update and recommendation on the development of Toronto's Shelter Safety Action Plan. This is an update from the chair of the supporting unhoused rights holders working group with recommendations on the development of the Toronto Shelter Safety Action Plan. I'm just going to say a couple of things as the chair of the working group. This working group did meet. We were referred a consultation from the ECDC, the Economic and Community Development Committee at the City of Toronto, to provide input to the Toronto Shelter Safety Action Plan that was brought forward. We had a presentation at the fullness of the 8-track of the Housing Rights Advisory Committee. It was then referred to the working group to have a closer look and consideration in discussion with staff from Toronto Shelter and Support Services. The minutes of that meeting are included in the materials for this meeting, as are the recommendations or input rather that was provided in that conversation. I would highlight just very briefly that the focus of the recommendation of the input that was offered to the staff from TSSS focused on the importance of non-discrimination within the shelter system, the importance that people have intersectional realities and identities as they may seek services within the shelter system, and that this system needs to be responsive and respectful to that, recognizing the dignity of the person. Other human rights concerns raised included security of tenure, so the concern around service restrictions that may be a threat to people who are using the services. There was also concern about accountability and the ability of users of the system to register complaints and the impact that that would have on them, and concerns around training. I think these are well captured in the notes that have been provided to TSSS as a response from the working group. However, I do want to simply table it at this moment to the committee. I believe we have a speaker to the item. And so I refer to, it's Carrie Ann Thomas again. So I don't believe she's here. So we don't have a speaker. What I will do, however, is ask if the committee has any further comments. You've had an opportunity to see the feedback. Are there any comments from committee members before we move to a motion? So without any further comments, I guess that means that Working Group 1 did the job. So thank you very much to Working Group 1 for the careful conversation and consideration of the report. May I ask someone to adopt the item? So this is received. It's a motion? There's a motion. Where is it? Oh, we have a motion on the board. Request that the City Clerk send the Housing Rights Advisory Committee's feedback to the Economic and Community Development Committee for consideration with the report from the General Manager, Toronto Shelter and Support Services regarding the Shelter Safety Action Plan. May I have someone move that? Thank you, Anne-Marie. All in favor? I'm looking for hands on the screen. Thank you very much, and carried. Wonderful. So we can now move forward to item 3, which is a report from the Improving Access to Housing Working Group, Chair Update. And I believe the chair of this committee is my co-chair, Anne-Marie. Sorry? So we're going through each of the working groups. So the second working group is Improving Access to Housing Working Group. The working group met. Anne-Marie was elected chair of that working group. The minutes are included. I don't know if you have anything further to add at this point, or simply that the minutes capture the conversation that was had.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
I don't have anything extra to add to whatever was already captured. We only had one meeting, and so far we're just like looking into the logistics around access and stuff. So there's not much work being done yet. Like, it's just the preliminaries and starting to have conversations. So that's where we're at with that. We'll leave it at where it's at until we meet again. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any questions from committee members? Yes, Harmy.
No questions. It's more to highlight the importance of, in terms of access to housing and the additional complexities that gender-based violence in the city face. And I think I am a member of this group, and I share my space with Anne-Marie. Thank you for co-chairing or chairing that working group. But I think that part of the discussion that I definitely highlighted is that issue of the fact that actually the presenter this morning spoke about how complex is the issue of having people in shelters for a long amount of time, and that's exactly is what's happening right now. Victims of violence are staying in shelters for years now. It used to be months, and so access to housing is a key priority for those who are working in the sector and are serving them every day. That's all I wanted to add, because it was a really important conversation that we're starting to have in the working group. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that, because I actually echo that. The housing issue is complex, but even with the complexity, priorities are priorities. And I do believe that in all of the conversations that we're having, access is key. And we have to ensure that we make that a core conversation piece going forward too, that access becomes a huge part of our conversation. So thank you for bringing that forward.
Thank you. So if there are no further questions or comments, I would ask for a motion to receive the information. Thank you, B. And all in favor, if I could see hands. Excellent, thank you very much. Motion carried. So that brings us to item 4, Maintaining Housing Working Group. The Maintaining Housing Working Group is focused on, we talked a little bit about this. I'm going to give the chair of the working group, Saroja, a chance to just report on it, and then we do have a speaker on the item. So Saroja, over to you first.
Okay, hi, I'm Saroja. I'm the new chair for the Maintaining Housing Working Group. So we did review the working group guidelines and had no comments to add. We discussed chair responsibilities and I was elected. Thanks, everybody. We discussed a human rights-based analysis tool and the importance of considering housing policy through the 7 principles of housing adequacy. We also looked at the human rights-based approach and considerations around equity-deserving groups, such as folks living with experiencing gender-based violence, and how to keep them safe, and the importance of storytelling when envisioning how policies actually apply to distinct housing scenarios for renters. Throughout this discussion, we also talked about the potential outcomes of the new multi-tenant homes framework and what that impact might be on tenants via these 7 principles. And we looked at research done by Joy and Paul Connolly that looked at the economics of rooming houses. So we talked about how there are evidence-based concerns raised around a risk of multi-tenant homes potentially shutting down if landlords determine that the costs of renovations are too high to bring them up to code. So this is going to be an ongoing conversation for our group, and I believe a priority for our group to continue addressing. And we're all in agreement that preventing the permanent loss of multi-tenant homes remain a priority in regards to the implementation of the Renovictions bylaw as well. We were consulted by the Housing Secretariat on the Renovictions bylaw. I'm not going to get too much into that because there were many recommendations, but I did want to emphasize one that might be overlooked and hasn't been spoken about more generally is the need to support women-led households and to find adequate housing in the case of an eviction for renovation purposes, and especially for people facing gender-based violence, and considerations around how to keep these families safe and provide wraparound supports for them. We had a lot of recommendations around tenant education, the need for providing tenants with the right tools and resources much before renoviction happens so that they're equipped and confident to navigate the system if they do get renovicted, and talked about the importance of doing outreach in multiple languages, as well as working with community-based organizations to do that who already have established trust in communities. And yeah, there's a huge data piece that we wanted to emphasize, which is that collecting disaggregated data on the impact of Renovictions bylaw on tenants will be essential for understanding how the bylaw supports the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, and also identifies its unintended consequences. So we do have a recommendation around, we would love to consult further with the HRAC on the necessary metrics and indicators for the city around who is being impacted by renovictions and where. And this will help to ensure alignment with the outcomes of the bylaw and the realization of the right to adequate housing. So we welcome further consultation as the bylaw is implemented and evaluated with explicit consideration of human rights outcomes and impacts on rights holders. Thank you.
Thank you, Saroja. To the committee, does anyone have questions for Saroja on the input that was provided on the Renovictions bylaw or the working group? Harmy, go ahead.
Thank you. Not a question. Thank you, Saroja. That was a great summary. Just wanted to add one important piece around the importance of communicating and working closely with the housing pathways that is co-chaired by the city and with the violence against women sector. I thought that was a really key feedback we provided, because in my mind, we should be aligning with the work that's already happening that is either co-led or led by the city in order to enhance our impact. But thank you. That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Harmy. Any other further comments or questions from the committee before we go to speakers? We do have speakers for this item. Okay. Then we will turn to our speakers for item 4. On my list, I have Annette Trevorrow-Gausher from No Renovictions and also Carrie Ann Thomas. Annette, are you here in person? Is Annette online? No? All right, then we will move to, I understand Carrie Ann Thomas is here now? Hi, you're up. You come to the front there? Can somebody, yeah, there you go. Morning.
To be here.
And you will have 5 minutes.
Okay. My regrets for some of the time of the other important matters I would have liked to address. I'm a resident, and I'm also involved in a community organization started in 2021 called the Reset Community. Our objective is working with policy changes led predominantly by the community and for the community. I'm here today to share my story in housing vulnerability or high risks that is being experienced in underserved communities. My background comes from being a journalist working at Ontario Queen's Park. When I began living within a high-risk community was to do research, as well adapt or learn the lived experiences on what those who are experiencing a lot of the backhand systemic barriers are actually experiencing. Prior to that, I was actually involved in meeting them at roundtable discussions for those I worked with at Queen's Park. And many of the stories we heard there are a lot of the stories I ended up experiencing through my own housing experiences, lived experiences in high-risk communities. Now, there are certain documents I'd like to just kind of go quickly over, which includes the anti-racism initiative put through from the city between 2019, 2020, et cetera, and helping so-called Black communities. I say so-called Black communities because I reserve the right predominantly not to use the term Black, due to it being a very ambiguous word that does not define who we are as a people. So you might hear me say so-called or interchangeably use the word melanin or West Indian or Caribbean. That being said, there are a lot of severely vital, urgent security breaches that are happening within the housing environment. These breaches that are happening have not been presented in some of the recommendations for the Housing Action Plan, as well as the Anti-Black Racism Initiative objectives that have put forward through the city. These breaches include things that lead to mental health issues. And as we know, of the past few years, mental health has become a very serious, critical concern for people who are members of the melanin community, as well as the Indigenous nations. And these concerns and the security breach comes as a result of experiences that others are tabling forward of a term that CBC and even the Globe and Mail have put forward. And the term is called gang stalking. It's a covert operation that many believe is happening within the housing environment. It is what is leading to a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness, mental health issues, suicide, and falsely being admitted into the mental health wards and institutions and prescribed prescriptions that is affecting their overall mental health, growth, and development. Through the organization I started in the Reset community, I've had several people across Ontario call, or that I've met, that have shared their stories personally. Many times it include hours on the phone, and all their stories are the same. So I'll say quickly what's happening is there are reports within the housing environment, whether you live in a home, whether you live in a good residential community, or whether you live in Toronto community housing. I myself have experienced that, and I'll share quickly, since we only have 5 minutes, my own experience. When I first came across this, I didn't even know what was happening. I was just being pushed and tugged in every direction you could think of. Every store I went to, anything I went, there was this constant covert attacks, like a Casper the Friendly Ghost type of thing. These are the things that people are experiencing, that when they go to the psychiatrist or a counselor or social worker or the Black Creek Community Health, they're being labeled as delusional or sociopaths or other things that would seem that what they're experiencing is just a phantom experience. Now, when I was experiencing it, it felt like that phantom too. But because I'm doing research, I have a background in journalism, I'm just looking at myself separate from these experiences and just looking at the bigger picture to be non-partial to what these experiences were, until I met with my own housing situations in these high-risk communities. The residents had shared their stories before, but I had not believed it. Others told me, and I did not believe. So today, what I'm asking is that with every single, or requesting that this be tabled within the minutes and be brought forward to the mayor with the new deal that's happening with Ontario, to really see how they can do a review and assessment on these threats that are being posed across high-risk communities, and then using that as the baseline of how you reformat the housing action plan, as well to reformat the anti-racism initiatives that are put forward in our community. For it does not include these security threats that victims are facing. And why this is important is that it's becoming a pandemic. There are too many people with the same stories of all different ages, and some have died. One of the clients that I've spoken to shared with me another one that we know has passed away. Her comment was, well, it looks like they got to her. Who are they? We don't know. But what I have seen through my report is a consistent similarity between those that are coming forward who do not know each other. So of all these random acts, it's peculiar to me as a researcher, and as well from my lived experience, to see that there's similarities. Now, my lived experience in the housing component opened up my eyes because of my own systemic barriers that I witnessed happen that did not make sense. It led me to step aside from my work as a journalist to start to assess what's happening personally in my life in the housing matter. And this is when I discovered what was happening that was brought forward by other people who experienced the same thing. And that's when I first discovered gang stalking.
So Carrie Ann, you're a minute over.
Sure. Can I give the recommendation if that's okay, Minister?
Go right to the recommendation.
There's a case called Chowdhury, and there are other cases that have been brought forward through the City of Toronto, including lawsuits. And this thing has been brought forward. And what I'm pleading today is that it is urgently tabled, that every agency, board, stakeholder, commission, and any other affiliates within the City of Toronto and all levels of government put this on their top line agenda as a mandatory security need to further investigate, explore, scan, and do a cross-reference across every agency.
It includes the Toronto Police Services, the TTC, and especially Toronto Community Housing. It also includes shelters, which means if the $4.23 billion the city's accumulating already for revenue, and all of these agencies have been called in as potential aggregates of threats being posed against the victims or citizens of Toronto and Ontario. I believe it's very vital, it's very urgent, as though a fire is being called, to have every board and agency do a cross-reference review with the mental health department and see how many cases of people are coming forward with these statements that are being labeled crazy or being sent to the mental hospital. This is very extremely important to the constituents of the City of Toronto.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. Are there questions from committee members, questions of clarification, or other questions to the speaker?
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you for coming and for bringing your concerns forward and for speaking to it in such profound ways. I really do believe that mental health issues and concerns should be addressed, even as we talk about housing, because a lot of the precarity speaks to that too, right? And so thank you for coming and being that voice for others who can't be here. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could, before finishing, just to leave it here for recommendations for future upcoming meetings, that this be tabled as well with the mayor and cross-reference with the Ontario government for the new deal that the partnership is. This is
Actually,
a
not an
cry.
opportunity to respond in the order. Is that
Oh,
okay? Thank you.
okay. Just one more thing. It is very, really, really critical. I don't mean to take up your time.
Thank you.
It's just that this is a vital situation. It is urgent, very urgent. And I'm asking each and every one of you, if you don't know about this as yet, to really make sure that you can look and investigate into it and take these recommendations.
Thank you. This has been very helpful. I think it's been well put on our radar. I certainly have learned, and I intend to follow up to learn more. So I appreciate your
Thank you.
yours.
Yes, I wanted to make
contribution.
mention of that as well, to kindly follow up with our group, and it's called the Reset.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Just one moment, Minister Carroll. I really respect the time that you gave to me, but I really, really need to emphasize one more time, because all of you are here in positions of elected roles or being appointed to help our constituents.
Actually, for clarification, we are not elected. We are an advisory. We don't actually have direct ability to direct staff. And so we're public appointments to this advisory committee on housing rights, but we're not elected.
Correct.
So thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, ma'am, but just one moment. This is a very important situation, like a fire that's exploding, and it's coming out of City Hall. One moment. And there are lawsuits that are pending already with the agencies, boards, commissions, and those who are even on boards. And what I want to emphasize again is how important this is. If you are in a role, even as an appointee, whether elected or not, this is not something to just quickly say thank you to and dismiss and say thank you for being here. I'm letting you know there is a fire before it explodes. And the City of Toronto already is experiencing lawsuits. It includes the Toronto.
And I'm not just saying thank you for being here. I'm saying information received. We've heard you, and we will absolutely pay attention to this. And I thank you for bringing it to our attention and for being here today. So thank you. Have we turned off our mic? Okay. We will not be, we are not in a position to make that recommendation. We're not able to direct staff. We don't have the authority. This is not a council committee. So what we have heard, and it is certainly tabled in the minutes, I believe, that we've heard this, is part of the public record. So thank you very much. You know what? We're at 10 minutes. We're at 11 minutes. What do we say? Just submit a letter to whom? You can submit a letter to the committee. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. And now we have a motion Motion to receive the Renovictions. Oh, we have a motion coming up on the screen. Thank you to the clerk. The motion is that the Housing Rights Advisory Committee recommends that City Council consider the feedback from the Maintaining Housing Working Group when it considers PH 16.4, implementing a rental renovation license bylaw to address renovictions, and 2, request that the city clerk to transmit its decision on this item to City Council when it considers PH 16.4. Can I please have a motion? Thank you, Saroja. And all in favor? Seeing hands go up. Thank you very much. Gord, you're in favor of that motion. Thank you. And carried. And thank you, Saroja, and to the working group for the work done on that and the work that is still to come. Moving forward to the next item, we have number 5, increasing adequate housing supply working group update on key priorities. And I'm going to turn that over to Bahar, who is the chair of that working group.
Thanks for that. So I'll just give a quick summary of the discussion that we had at the first Working Group 4 meeting. All of our work will intersect, obviously, with other working groups, and especially as Saroja just went through the renovations policy, and as well as the multi-tenant homes, that also came up in our discussion. Really what we wanted to focus on was that rights holders need housing options that meet their needs, whether it's around affordability, adequacy, maintenance, safety, and so on. And in our discussions, we identified a few focus areas. One was around multi-tenant houses to ensure that they're maintained, repaired, as well as preserved in terms of their long-term affordability, and that intersects very much so with protecting the rights of the tenants that live in those rooming houses as well. We had a lot of discussion around supportive housing, where there's a primary focus on that and the importance of the wraparound supports that are needed for rights holders who are exiting homelessness, and expanding the development of supportive housing in a way that can be scaled up, as well as really measuring progress at the city level for us to understand if the outcomes that are being identified are being met. The other focus area was on the denial of housing, and this would be something that would be part of all the work that we will focus on, which is the importance of centering lived and living experiences. And we also discussed how had a very short conversation around accessibility, but looking at modular housing programs and how accessibility needs can be met through that form of housing development. And lastly, a lot of the discussion was around rental housing, supportive housing, but we also wanted to look at pathways to homeownership, especially for historically disadvantaged, marginalized groups who haven't been able to have the same levels of homeownerships. So those were the main focus areas based on our very first conversation.
Thank you, Bahar. To the committee members, does anyone have a question or comment to Bahar regarding the working group minutes and report from the committee meeting, the working group meeting, rather? Seeing no hands go up, we do have speakers to this item. First speaker is Ghazi Sijan. Is Ghazi here or online? No. Okay. Next speaker is Miguel Alvarez. He's online. So we'll bring Miguel up, and Miguel, are you there? There you are. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this issue of housing. I had two recommendations to make. One is in view that I learned from a friend of mine who is a TCSC resident. He suffered from respiratory illnesses. And in his quest to find a unit that accommodates his human rights, it was really difficult to find a building that only caters to non-smokers. I understand your region has up to 4 buildings that accommodate people with respiratory problems, but in the city of Toronto, that is not available, is my understanding. So I'm here to recommend to this committee to make this is only a city advisory committee, the need to increment the number of units or buildings for people that suffer respiratory problems. The other thing I want to add is also we need to increase the number of assets for seniors like myself. I'm almost 60 years old, so I'm a young senior, and I look forward to live in Regent Park. However, when I went into the office and inquire about my future locations, they said they're going to send me over to Etobicoke, North Etobicoke, North Scarborough, where no man's land, no services, no doctors attached to my file. So it's going to be a difficult task to me to restart in a new neighborhood where I have set roots. And that is not just my problem. The other problem is across the GTA, the TCSC portfolio. I know we have a seniors division, but the number of units have not increased. Perhaps the mayor and his staff, if they're listening to this conversation, they could make sure that in the budget 2025, money is found to allocate those units for seniors like, hey, I am going to be one of those. So I require special services. You know what I'm saying? Someone, be personal support workers, etc., psychiatrists, you name it, right? Any discipline of medical health. Unfortunately, at 220 Oak Street, we're trying to develop that with Quota Inspires, but we only have 8 hours of services from this organization, and it will be wonderful if being allowed to them to serve this building for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because after the pandemic, the number of people with mental health and mental addictions has tripled. This is not a joke, friends. This is the jungle. So we need to address the issues that we are facing with by investing in organizations like Quota Inspires that will allow them to deal with the overwhelming problem. I have met with them, and they know that there is no money to hire more staff. So it requires political will, federal money. I don't think about Doug Ford is going to send any money to us anyway. And the other thing I want to add is we need to review the noise bylaw complaint system, how we address noises during the night. A lot of residents walk through the hallways, stay awake in their units during the nighttime. I'm supposed to be at City Hall today. I can't because I only slept 2 hours. It's because there's a noise happening under my unit, and it's keeping me awake. I'm not here to beg you for anything, but to make recommendations to the city 311 to investigate these type of complaints that perhaps don't require investigations. I think my councilor Chris Moyes made a motion at ECD last week with the hopes that 311 can investigate noise complaints that occurs very often, and we should be able to enjoy our unit and sleep. So thank you again for allowing me to speak, and I hope you take my recommendations, which is about free smoking buildings and more senior buildings with services, or here at 220 Oak, we can invest on Quota Inspires to provide 24 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. I've opened it to the committee if anyone has questions for Miguel. No, sorry, that's not in order. That's to the committee. So Miguel, I would say thank you. You've raised a number of issues that are important. Some of them are outside of what we are able to act on, but you're raising issues around ability to have health matters dealt with within TCH. You've raised the issue around availability of supportive housing and issues of noise. These are all very important for people living in that context, and I thank you for bringing that to our attention. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Carrie Ann, you're listed on as wanting to speak to this. Or are you speaking to the question of supply? To the issue of supply of housing. Okay.
Reports as well that are coming in from many of the victims, or maybe I shouldn't use victims, but from those who are experiencing casualties. This is what we would call a noise campaign. According to the topic that I've mentioned before, I will just call it GS going forward because it's a taboo topic which many don't want to touch on. There have been complaints. I get many complaints all the time of residents speaking of the same thing. Noise coming from upstairs, noise coming from downstairs. I've even experienced it in my own unit. It was a strong humming, buzzing noise that would continue. The first time I heard the noise, one of the clients who came to our reset community had to stay with me because she went to the hospital for her leg. And when she came back, they were trying to put her into the mental hospital. I had to vouch on behalf of hers for the community organization that I represent, and she stayed with me to avoid. She sensed the noise before I heard the noise and would tell me that these noises are coming into my unit. Didn't believe her. Once she left, about a month later, the noise began, strong humming noise, and it consisted till about 6 months or less. There are other noise that come from residents that do a lot of shuffling, extra noise. I have another resident in my community. Every time I see her, she's complaining about the resident above where she also, like Miguel, cannot sleep. So the topic I'm trying to say here on top of the housing supply and the funding that's coming in from many of these agencies and community services that are being provided and being funded to contribute to the $4.3 billion, it's possible based on the research that I'm getting fed to me and through using research tactics and observation within my lived experiences. Miguel is saying is very accurate, and many people are complaining about what they call noise campaigns. It is part of the very thing I'm bringing to you that is urgent. What I'm trying to recommend here on this next topic is if there's going to be an increase of supply for housing, and if there's going to be affordable housing on top of women-led, especially this group, because predominantly of the reports that have been coming into me or into our organization is from women, young, mid-age, and especially elders. So seeing that Miguel is an elder as well, this part is very critical because a lot of the elders are also experiencing this. So the point I'm asking here goes back again to the recommendation why I'm here, is I attended the city budget meeting that was taking place virtually just the other day, and got to see all the different agencies and where the money's coming from, including Toronto Parking Authority. You have TTC, and many of the agencies, including the recent, the City of Toronto mentions partnership for the Anti-Black Racism Initiative 2017. That it should include the Board of Health, the Toronto Library Board, Toronto Police Services, and the Toronto Community Housing Board. Many of these are the same people that have been brought forward by people who have put forward petitions. People have done extensive research and put their documents out there. And I recommend that the city and those of you on this committee and cross-reference this with other committees, part of the City of Toronto. And that is the case with Chowdhury versus the TPS. And it details a lot of what I'm saying here. You might see some cross-references to what Miguel is saying. What I'm asking urgently on behalf of the concerned citizens, they say if you see something suspicious, report it. They've been reporting it and they're being labeled crazy. As a result of the increase of mental health being associated with growing community, I'm asking really as an urgent recommendation to reevaluate and do a cross-reference across all agencies to see how many are reporting these types of incidences, so we could start getting a really overview picture of what's happening and base now the funding and the strategies around this type of baseline, because these residents are looking to be protected. So if the city is going to build more houses and this type of operation is happening in the background, these are more people who are being subjected to these types of things that Miguel, that you have just heard say. And I get a lot of those things that Miguel has to say every day. That being said, I'm asking because if Chowdhury actually went and presented this and what people are experiencing, by not tackling this immediately, you're risking yourself having to possibly face lawsuits. And this would probably be one of the biggest lawsuits because it's already being brought forward in the courts. So it's being tabled that you take this very seriously to really do a cross-reference scan across all your boards and put forward a new study and base the housing initiative plans, the new housing you want to build, and do consultations and rework the budget around this as an idea, as possible reasons that are affecting the issues on why there's a Housing Advisory Committee Board. And our final recommendation is to start a new committee based on this type of idea here that can actually manage and elect or bring others onto its board that can do this type of cross-reference scanning investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the committee, does anyone have questions to the speaker?
Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
So at this point then, we have, I would move to receive the item for information, which was the report from Working Group 4. All in favor? Can I please see a show of hands? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. And Lindsay, I'm assuming your hand is up. I can't see Lindsay, but her hand is not down. So we'll say that that has been carried. Thank you. We have, the next item is an overview and discussion of the housing progress update. It will be a presentation by staff. I am going to suggest that we take a 3-minute break, just a 3-minute health break. I think people would like that. We'll make it 5-minute health break, and we will come back. Thank you. Go to the washroom. Oh, thank you. Not too bad. How are you? How was the train ride this morning? Okay, we're going to get back, so call to order. Before we move on to item 6, I would like to, or sort of, are we at 7 now? Hold on. We are moving toward number 6. I want to go back to item 7, which sounds strange, but item 7 was when we had Leilani join us, and there was discussion about putting our thoughts into a letter to the executive committee. So what we're going to do is we're going to return to the motion to include Leilani to also amend the item. Can I have that up on the screen, please? Is there a first motion that we have to do? Oh, okay, so this is the motion. And what we are going to do is, and this is as per our ability and what we're allowed to do and say and what effect we have, is that we will request the city clerk to submit a letter to the executive committee on behalf of the Housing Rights Advisory Committee with the following. The Housing Rights Advisory Committee is seriously concerned with the proposal by mayors in Ontario and the Premier of Ontario to invoke the notwithstanding clause in order to override the charter rights of individuals who are unhoused and unsheltered in Ontario cities by clearing encampments, imposing involuntary treatment and incarceration for repeated trespass. This contravenes our commitments under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It fundamentally opposes the right to life and security of the person as protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and is inconsistent with the National Housing Strategy Act. The Housing Rights Advisory Committee strongly encourages the City of Toronto to continue its work and commitment under the Toronto Housing Charter to realize the right to housing for every resident in this city. Are there any questions before we move to a motion? Yes, Gord.
Yeah, just very quickly. I understand that this committee does provide advice through the executive committee. But my preference at this point would be that the committee simply take this position rather than forward an item for consideration. The city is doing its own work to consider its response, and I know that the mayor has also publicly made a response. I don't feel that we're at a place yet where providing this advice through the council or through the executive committee is the right path.
So what would the form of that look like then, Gord?
If we could strike send a letter to the executive committee and substitute instead that the Human Rights Advisory Committee state its view that, and then continue.
And so simply that it goes into the record?
Yes.
I'm looking to the clerk to get approval that we can reword it and form it that way. We're going to hold it down and come back to it. Thank you, Gord. Okay, we'll go to item 6. Is that all right, Gord?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. So we will come back to this again after item 6. So item 6, welcome, Mercedes. And sorry, I was expecting Matt there, but it's not Matt.
I'll do the introduction.
Okay, fantastic. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Mercedes Madani. I'm the Acting Director of Housing Policy and Strategy at the City of Toronto's Housing Secretariat, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Kira Hart, Senior Strategic Policy Consultant at the Housing Secretariat. Thank you for the opportunity today to talk to you briefly about the Housing TO 2020-2030 Action Plan and also to provide you with a brief update on the progress made to date in implementation of this plan. Throughout my presentation today, specifically in the first part, I will highlight instances where the implementation of the Housing TO plan has been impacted and influenced by changes in the housing system at the local, provincial, and national levels. And I will also speak to areas where the city has been able to leverage the Housing TO plan to address the changing housing needs of its residents, as well as the changing legislative environment since 2020. In the second part of my presentation, I will focus on the housing TO targets, and we can have a deep dive around the progress that has been made on the targets since 2020. So as you know, the Housing TO 2020-2030 Action Plan was adopted by City Council in 2019. It serves as a blueprint for action across the housing continuum, so from shelters to supportive and social housing, all the way to affordable and market rental and ownership housing. The development of the Housing TO Plan was informed by lessons learned from the previous 10-year housing plan that the City of Toronto had, as well as evidence and insight from a housing market analysis study that really gave us a snapshot of the housing market, as well as the considerable challenges that our residents face, not only in current times, but forecasted into the future, into the next 10 to 20 years. We also took into consideration directions from City Council, including one that directed us to look at applying the human right lens into housing as part of the development of the Housing TO Plan. And we also conducted extensive public and stakeholder consultations. We were able to engage over 6,000 members of the public and stakeholders through our consultation process that were held both online and in person. The development of the Housing TO Plan was also guided by an external advisory committee that had housing experts, representatives from a range of housing organizations, including nonprofit, Indigenous, women-serving housing organizations, to name a few, as well as people with lived experiences of poverty, precarious housing, and homelessness. The Housing TO Plan has 13 key strategic themes that you can see on the screen, but really what it does, it focuses our actions into 5 main priority areas. One around creating new supply that meets the needs of our residents, as well as protecting and preserving our existing housing supply. Given that about half of Toronto households are renter households, the Housing TO Plan has a specific actions and recommendations around supporting renters and improving their housing stability. The plan also has a specific actions that respond to diverse housing needs of our residents. Most importantly, our priority population groups, including Indigenous, Black and racialized communities, women, seniors, gender diverse people, among others. And it is a priority for the Housing TO Plan to make sure that our programs and policies can respond to the changing environment, that those can be updated and transformed in response to what we see in the housing market. As you very well know, the Housing Charter is a critical component of the Housing TO Plan. The Charter is a policy that recognizes adequate housing as a fundamental human right that is recognized in international law, and that all orders of government, including municipalities, have a role to play to advancing the progressive realization of housing to adequate housing. And we heard from Leilani this morning that spoke very eloquently about how this Charter can be incorporated into our everyday work around implementation of the Housing TO Plan. Since then, again, as you very well know, the Human Rights Advisory Committee is established. The city now has a role dedicated under the Ombudsman Office around systematic housing issues that our residents face. And the city will continue to implement the Housing Charter through developing enhanced training programs for staff, so that we as a staff know how to apply the human rights approach into our daily work. Creating opportunities to have intergovernmental dialogue around implementation of the Housing TO Plan with that human rights lens incorporated, as well as we have committed to provide council with an independent assessment of our progress in moving towards the right to adequate housing in 2025 and 2030, so in the midpoint and the final year of the implementation of the Housing TO Plan. So in 2020, when not only the city of Toronto, but globally, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe it was one of the first instances that the Housing TO Plan and the Housing Charter really guided the city in prioritizing the need of those in greatest need. When our shelter system was immensely under pressure due to the need for physical distancing, the city focused its resources and its attention, so both from financial perspective and from staffing perspective, to increase supportive housing opportunities for people experiencing homelessness. Since 2020, the city has added over 3,000 supportive homes or supportive housing opportunities across the city. Some of these have been through new construction on city land. Some of them have been through purchasing existing properties like hotels, motels, and shelter hotels and converting them to permanent supportive housing, as well as through leveraging vacant units in Toronto community housing and adding the wraparound support services that people exiting homelessness need to be able to start their journey towards health and well-being. While supportive housing continues to be a priority for the City of Toronto, in late 2022, as a city, and again, everywhere around the world, we started moving towards recovery. City Council directed the staff to develop a housing action plan for the 2022-2026 term of council. While the housing action plan is very much aligned with the priorities and principles of the housing TO plan, it brings to focus the actions and the initiatives that we need to increase the supply of housing, both market and non-market housing. It was also critical for us to develop this plan as we received the provincial housing target of 285,000 housing starts that we need to meet or exceed by 2031. The Housing Action Plan has a number of priorities that, again, you see on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, but really the main focus of this plan is around removing policy and zoning barriers to building housing. Again, both market and non-market housing across the city. So you can see a lot of our official plan policies are going to go under review with that focus in mind. The Housing Action Plan also focuses on leveraging public land. And again, this goes beyond just the city land. It also focuses on activating school district boards' lands, as well as academic institutions and other orders of government that can be leveraged to build more housing. HAP also focuses on preserving the existing supply of homes, again, going beyond just the programs that we have, the multi-unit residential acquisition program that you might be familiar, but it also focuses on official plan policies that we have so that we can protect our existing supply of homes in future years. And it also looks at the role of the community housing sector in building more housing. The result of this has been a community housing modernization and growth strategy that was brought forward this year in June of this year to committee and council that again recognizes the important role that our community housing sector has in not only developing new housing but also maintaining their existing homes, modernizing their sector and protecting their tenants. Later in 2023, the city reiterated its commitment towards building new affordable rental homes through the generational transformation of Toronto's housing system. Through this report, City Council increased our housing targets under the Housing TO Action Plan. Previously, the Housing TO had a target of approving 40,000 affordable rental homes. Through the generational transformation report, this target got expanded. So now we have a target of 65,000 rent-controlled homes, including 41,000 affordable rental. Again, for the first time under the Housing TO plan, we have a target for rent geared to income housing. This is the housing that will be affordable to very low-income people who are in receipt of OW and ODSP. And we now have a target for rent-controlled homes. Again, this is an area that, in lieu of provincial legislation around giving the tenants the rent control measures that they need, the city is taking action to build more rent-controlled homes. And along with this target, the report also introduced initiatives and tools that the city, again, can take on its own to advance this target, including identifying over 50 city-owned sites that can be activated for housing, as well as a number of program and policy measures that would need to go along with that, such as introducing a public developer model where the city, through this model, will take an intentional role in not only maintaining the ownership of the homes, but also playing a role in developing a range of housing on city-owned sites. So now let's zoom in a little bit on the housing TO targets specifically and where we are in terms of our progress towards meeting them. As you might know, since 2020, the city has prepared annual update reports on the delivery of the housing TO plan. We have also created online tools and mechanisms so that members of the public and stakeholders and those interested can follow along the progress that the city is making towards these targets in a transparent and accountable manner. So in early 2023, the City of Toronto launched the Housing TO Plan dashboard that provides an overview of the targets of the Housing TO Plan. It provides annual updates on where we are in meeting these targets. As you can see on the left-hand side, you can see a snapshot of each target and where we are in our progress. And when you click on kind of these little scorecards, you can see the progress on a year-over-year basis. The progress towards these targets are also included as part of the open data portal so that those who are interested can download the results and do their own analysis with them. As part of the online tool, we also created a housing data hub that provides an overview and affordable rental housing pipeline and where they are in their process. And also, more recently, we have added a new feature to the dashboard that tracks our progress towards meeting the provincial 285,000 housing target as well. A critical component of our reporting on the Housing TO Plan and making sure that we're on track is around tracking the investments made by the city and other orders of governments towards delivery of the Housing TO Plan. In late 2023, as part of the Generational Transformation Report, when our housing supply targets were updated, we also updated the costing of the Housing TO Plan. So as you can see, we estimate that the delivery of the Housing TO Plan is going to cost all orders of government between $44 to $47 billion. Just under $12 billion of this commitment has been secured over the past 4 years. As you can see, majority of that is coming from the City of Toronto, with federal and provincial governments while making significant contributions. As you can see, there's a lot more that we need from other orders of government to make sure that we can implement this program and achieve our targets by 2030. So I'm going to take you briefly through our progress towards the 5 key outcome areas under the Housing TO Plan. Again, all of this information is online, so I encourage you to look through the dashboard in more details. The other piece that I want to clarify here is that what I'm presenting today is really just a snapshot of the Housing TO targets and not inclusive of all the actions and the work that the City of Toronto and its partners do on an annual basis in advancing the Housing TO plan. So we're only focusing on the targets that were set as part of the development of the Housing TO plan. So as you can see, when it comes to creating new supply, we are making good progress towards approving new rent-controlled homes. Out of the 65,000 rent-controlled homes target, we have already approved over 23,000 by the end of 2023. What we're not seeing a lot of progress is really around approving new affordable rental homes that are for Indigenous, by Indigenous, or new affordable rental homes that are going to women and gender diverse people. The other area that we're not seeing a lot of progress is translating these approvals into housing starts and actual homes where people can live. So the City of Toronto has taken some steps to address that gap in 2024. Through the rental housing supply program, the city allocated over $300 million of its funding towards getting some of these approvals to housing starts by 2026. But again, more needs to be done here in terms of making sure that these approvals can actually become homes for people. In terms of protecting and preserving existing supply, again, what we see is that, for example, the multi-unit residential acquisition program, the MIRA program, is making great strides in helping the nonprofit sector purchase properties that could be at risk of being lost in the market and converting them to affordable rental housing for 99 years. One of the areas that we're still lagging behind is our Toronto Taking Action on Tower Renewal program. This is a program that helps rental towers to make energy efficiency modifications and retrofits. The program was under review, but is up and running as of mid-2023. So we're hoping that we will catch up in the coming years on our targets around supporting energy retrofit in tower renewal program. In terms of assisting renters, again, the city is making good progress in eviction prevention as well as providing support services to people where they currently live. And both of these have a significant impact on improving housing stability and making sure that eviction prevention measures are in place for people who might be at risk of becoming homeless. Where we are not seeing a lot of progress is around housing benefits. We know Toronto is a very expensive market for renters. We know our OW and ODSP benefits have been stagnant for years. Incomes are not keeping pace with our rents. So we really need more housing benefits to be able to help our renter households maintain their housing. One of the main programs that's helping us in this regard is the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit Program, which has been very helpful in helping people exit homelessness to housing. But the allocation that the City of Toronto has received over the years under this federal or provincial program has not been sufficient to really meet the needs of our residents. In terms of long-term care and supporting our seniors, again, the City of Toronto started a new program, a DC deferral program for nonprofit long-term care providers to bring more long-term care beds online. This program, which was established in 2022, has already been making good progress towards meeting its targets. Where we are lagging behind is around the City of Toronto being able to add net new long-term care beds in city-run facilities. Last year, City Council signaled to the province that in the absence of having additional and sufficient funding for long-term care, the city will not be able to add any net new long-term care beds to its facilities as part of its redevelopment. One of the components of the housing TO plan is helping our renters and first-time home buyers be able to break into the very expensive home ownership market that we have in the city. Again, one of the longest-standing programs around providing a land transfer tax rebate for first-time home buyers has been successful in assisting over 65,000 first-time home buyers since 2020. We have been providing property tax relief for low-income seniors to be able to maintain their costs of living at a reasonable rate so that their housing stability is protected. Where we are not seeing a lot of progress is around building net new affordable home ownership opportunities. This program, which had a review done by Auditor General a couple of years ago, is under review. We're hoping to bring a report forward to Council later this year. And again, we're hoping when that program is back online and in operation, we can continue to catch up on our targets around building net new affordable ownership opportunities for low-income residents. And really, this takes me to my last slide of the presentation today, which is working around preparing the midpoint review of the housing TO plan. As I discussed, on an annual basis, we have already been looking at our progress, tracking our progress, seeing where we're falling behind and seeing where we're making good progress. But 2025, our midpoint review will be a good opportunity for us to, again, assess our progress, and start planning for where we need to course correct, where we need to adjust our priorities and targets. We also have a direction from council to make sure that we can provide an independent assessment of the city's progress in advancing the realization of the right to adequate housing as part of this midpoint review. So right now we're in the scoping phase for this program. So it's a great opportunity to be here and talk to the committee and gather your feedback as we're moving forward to hire a consultant to undertake the review and help us with consultations that we need to do. And we're hoping to bring back a report to committee and council later in 2025. So with that, I thank you for your time. I know it was a long presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions or welcome any feedback that the members would have.
Thank you, Mercedes. And I don't think it was that long. I think it could have gone on for 3 more hours and we still wouldn't have covered everything. So thank you very much. So as a first step, I'd like to open it to our committee. If there are any questions or comments about the presentation. Harmy.
Thank you, Mercedes and Kira, for your presentation. I have to say, I'm having a hard time remaining optimistic. And this is obviously, you've done this before. This has more than anything to do with us as a city. It's obvious to me that we're failing women, we're failing seniors and Indigenous communities. And I worry because we're here and we're expected as committee members to oversee the implementation of the plan. I appreciated the note on the item of women-led households that you added on your slide because it speaks about data collection. And I have to say, I did go into the dashboard. That's actually what I do before I go to bed and to fall asleep a little bit because, it's just to go and see what it is. And I am afraid that I couldn't find a lot of information that I was hoping to find. And I'm assuming that it is because of the lack of data being collected as to why are we failing so much. And the number 24 over 1,000 only in 2023 for women-led households, it's a big concern to me, especially because I'm here. I do represent not only who I am as a professional in terms of that work that I've been doing for the past couple of decades, but it also is concerned in terms of what we can do from now on. So I just wanted to add that piece and be on record as to the concern I have, and not only as a expert, I'm going to say, in the violence against women sector, but as a committee member and how much we're failing. Kudos, though, to some of the other areas where we are on track, but because who I am, I tend to pay attention to where we're not doing well. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Harmy. Anyone else on the committee? Saroja.
Thank you. I just had a question about the protecting affordability of nonprofit homes targets, and just wanted to get a little bit more of a sense of why the targets are falling behind there.
So this is a program called Community Housing Partnership Renewal Strategy. I have to make sure I keep the acronym right. It's CHIPR. And the way that the program works is that it works with nonprofit organizations that are nearing the expiry of their operating agreements, and would work with them to bring them under a new type of agreement where they can continue to benefit from city benefits, for example, property tax exemption after the expiry of their operating agreement, so that they can maintain the rents at an affordable rent. So some of this is really related to when these organizations reach that milestone. So last year, we didn't have any organization that got to that point, or that if they weren't able to finalize getting them under the new program. So some of it is really related to when those operating agreements are set to expire, but the program exists, and the Housing Secretariat has a very strong relationship with all the community housing providers at the city. One of the part of the role of the Housing Secretariat is administration of community housing, including TCH and over 200 nonprofit housing organizations. So through those relationships, the city is very much encouraging the community housing organizations as they reach the expiry of their operating agreements to come under the new program framework and be able to continue to maintain those affordable rents for their residents.
Thank you. I do have a follow-up question, but I can wait until others have a chance to ask.
Nobody has their hand up just now, so go ahead.
Yeah, this question's it's unrelated, but I'm interested in the rental supply housing program. Can you speak to how long these units will remain rent controlled for, the RGI units? And if they're not rent controlled in perpetuity, what are the barriers that are keeping them from being rent controlled? And I also wanted to ask, will landlords be able to charge tenants an extra 2% above the provincial guideline at some point?
So I'll try to answer all of the questions. So on the rent geared to income housing, the rents, as you know, are geared to 30% of households' income or the shelter allowance of their OW or ODSP. So the increase or the decrease are tied to incomes rather than the rent control. All of our affordable rental homes that are supported by the City of Toronto are what we used to call rent control. So the rents cannot increase what the province set as the provincial guidelines on an annual basis. And again, this is something that would not have existed if it wasn't for the affordable housing programs that the City of Toronto runs, because as you know, none of the new rental housing supply that's coming online would be subject to rent control, because rent control measures were basically eliminated in 2018-19. So all the affordable rental homes are rent controlled at the provincial guidelines. The city, as of June of 2024, introduced a new stream of rent-controlled homes where only community housing providers have access to certain amount of city benefits to be able to build rent-controlled homes where rents are at 150% of average market rent, and the rent increases can go as high as guidelines plus 2%. This is a new stream of funding, again, in recognition of the fact that not only we need deeply affordable homes, but also purpose-built rental homes that can serve middle-income households in our city. This new program was established. All of the rent-controlled homes, in order for them to be eligible for city benefits, they need to have at least 30% of their residential gross floor area as affordable. So we're getting both affordable and rent-controlled homes in majority of these projects. The affordable rental homes and RGI and rent control, they need to maintain those rents for at least 40 years. We prioritize 99 years affordability. So if they provide us with that 99 years affordability, they will be prioritizing our review process. But the minimum is 40 years. I hope I answered all of your questions. If I missed anything, let me know.
Thank you so much. Yes, you did. I think it is concerning that there will be rent increases allowed to go above the 2% guideline on public lands. And I think, yeah, I'm really grateful that you highlighted this work for us. And yeah, it is also exciting to see the progress that we've made as a city on these targets. Thank you.
Who else has their hand? Anybody remote that has a question? Bahar, did you have a question?
Sorry, I thought Gord had something to say, but maybe I was wrong.
I have something to say on it, but I don't have a question.
Do you want to go, Gord, before I change the topic?
Sure. Yeah, just quickly. I appreciate that last exchange. These are really, really complicated waters. What the city has done is, even though the province says no new units will have rent control, we have established a narrow window where, when we are building social housing, not-for-profit, co-op, and Toronto Community Housing directly delivered housing, we will implement rent control. However, because we are not getting adequately funded by other orders of government to construct that housing, the business case on some proposals may not work and we may not get anything built. So we have told the staff, go look at all of those applications, see if we can stay at the same structure of rent control as the province. But if there are exceptions, it is permissible to look at those exceptions if they can stay 2% above the provincial guideline. It's still rent control, just at a different level. It's also worth noting that that will only apply to the market units, right? Only the market units. People in affordable or deeply affordable or supportive housing, it will still be tied to income. And only for socially owned housing. So if it's a co-op, it's literally people setting their own rents. If it's a not-for-profit, it's for, say, a partnership with the YWCA for women fleeing domestic violence, but these only apply to the market units. Anything below market is fixed. So it's a very tiny window, and it's designed specifically to see if there are projects that can go forward. It wouldn't have gone forward otherwise with that little bit of wiggle room. And once we establish that principle that it's rent controlled, we can continue to advocate that there be province-wide rent controls so that we can fix those costs permanently for all tenants.
Thank you for the clarification, Gord. That's helpful. Bahar?
Thanks for the presentation, Mercedes. I had a question. There was the delivery estimate slide about the investment that's required around 44 to 47 billion, which requires higher orders of government to put significant investments in there. What happens when they don't? Let's say if they don't, if we have a future federal government that slashes the Housing Accelerator Fund, as an example. Given that there are priorities, like there were the 13 actions, is there an approach to what action would be prioritized? Just curious. Yeah.
I prefer not to go there right now, but given all the housing challenges that we currently have, but it is a reality. So when the federal and provincial governments downloaded the responsibility of housing to municipalities decades ago, they unfortunately did not give us the financial tools to be able to respond and undertake the housing responsibilities. So for decades now, the City of Toronto, similar to many municipalities across Ontario and Canada, have been reliant on various federal and provincial housing programs and would rely on their own resources to complement those funding programs. For example, in the city, in the absence of having capital funding, for example, or operating funding from other orders of government, the city started using its financial incentives. So we are foregoing development charges, building permit fees, planning application fees, all the way to property taxes to be able to get some of these projects to a viable stage so that they can move forward. So we have been relying on tools that we have within the City of Toronto's abilities. We have also provided capital funding through, again, our DC Reserve Fund over the years that, again, will no longer have access to given the changes under the Bill 23 Act. So it is an ongoing and dynamic environment for us, and we try and align our housing policies and priorities with federal and provincial housing programs. We always try to lead the way by putting our own land, our incentives, our funding on the table, and encourage all the other orders of government to come to the table with their funding sources. In the absence of, again, Housing Accelerator Fund or any other funding that the federal and provincial government currently have committed to the city to provide, the city will have to reevaluate. We'll look at, again, what funding resources we have on the table. And that's where, again, going back to the conversation around supportive housing. where the city did not have a program to build supportive housing. But when we looked at where the need is greatest, we looked at our limited resources and we put those resources towards where the need was greatest, which was around supportive housing. So again, this will be, a dynamic situation that the city as a whole will have to respond to, given our reliance on federal and provincial government. We have also asked not only for funding, but low-cost financing. We have recently, through the new purpose-built rental housing supply, have asked the province to help us with a DC rebate program so that we can continue to support purpose-built rental homes. So if any of these don't come through or get slashed as part of changes at the federal provincial level, similar to what we have been doing over the past few years, we'll continue to adapt, reevaluate, and make sure that we can put our resources from the city's perspective where the need is greatest.
Lindsay, is that a question?
Hi, I just want to say this quickly. I am really grateful for the supportive housing and the increase in that. As a resident of Toronto Community Housing and the tenant representative, I'm noticing I think there can be further discovery into the kind of refusing to evict anybody because they are vulnerable, because we're all vulnerable if we're in community housing. There is kind of a ripple effect that is having on our community. And I think that supportive housing does need to be included in these refusing to evict anybody. So currently I reside above like a trap house where everyone just uses drugs all night and everyone comes and goes. And there's been 3 years of trying to evict or get support, and it is negatively affecting our entire community. But, more importantly, the children that have seen just horrific things and have heard horrific things, like everything is very close knit in community housing. A lot of the infrastructure is built a long time ago where sound is, we can hear everything. And, that's great that we're not evicting people that probably should be evicted, but definitely need support. And maybe implementing or looking into like a staged housing or like the supportive housing in terms of the modular buildings. If you can't quite accept the responsibility, or there's just no accountability for people anymore living in these circumstances because of the fragility of maybe having them be held accountable for their behavior, but implementing some kind of accountability in terms of the staged housing or the modular buildings where supports are built in, because not being able to evict somebody who is really negatively impacting the community is affecting everybody's safety, and it is affecting the community. And I think there needs to be a little bit more support for people residing already in vulnerable states or communities. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. I want to pick up a little bit on that because you're getting into some of the nuance behind the numbers. And so I want to say thank you to the staff that prepared this report. This is really helpful. I think to the point that Harmy made as well, what is missing, what data hasn't been disaggregated, what are we not able to see? And that brings me to the Midway report that you are now beginning to work on. You're beginning to scope. And that actually gets me excited from a human rights point of view, because I think it gives us the opportunity to move beyond just sort of big targets and get into actual human rights indicators that we want to see included in this, that would help us understand better where progress is really being made. Because at the end of the day, the human rights, the realization of the progressive realization of human rights means that we're tracking those human rights outcomes and how are we getting to them. I think what we have here in this report, and fairly, is that they're reporting against targets that were put in the plan. But I think there's an opportunity now to begin to refine that and begin to look to human rights indicators that we can be able to point at that may actually require more or different data, disaggregated data, so that we're able to answer some of the questions that I think Leilani challenged us with this morning. So the question about, who's being left behind on any one of those things? Are there particular neighborhoods? Are there particular communities that are more impacted than others? And that's what we need to be able to look at and point to so that we can say, yes, in fact, we are moving forward. I think it's great that there's a dashboard, but at this point, it's not multidimensional. And so if we want to be able to, with confidence, make comments about how well we are moving forward or standing still, or, we wouldn't want to be moving backward, or retrogression. We don't want to see that happen. So we need those indicators spelt out. And so I don't know if you're in a position at this point, but I know that you're going to be looking and procuring external support to do that midway report. I would like to know if there will be an intention to include depth of expertise on the right to housing as part of who gets that contract to build out that. I see that you're looking to do consultations with internal and external stakeholders, and so I'm hopeful that we will be included as part of that process. But I think that who does the evaluation and their ability to understand the housing rights framework and objectives and layers to it will be really, really critical, because I think this is a wonderful moment where we can embed some of that we can look at a dashboard and some of the transparency for the city to be able to point to how we're doing on these human rights indicators. And that obviously also lifts the opportunity for accountability on that report. So I'm not sure what you're able to say at this point, but that's my wordy question.
Thanks for that feedback. And again, that's why we're here, to receive that feedback, to make sure that we know what's important to the members of the HRAC committee as we undertake the midpoint review. So definitely having a deep expertise around bringing that human rights lens assessment into the plan is definitely part of the scope of work for the consultant. And it might be something that would be very, very kind of specialized to be able to help us get that expertise, so that I can confirm that that's on the table. Again, we're consulting and getting feedback about the overall scope, and again, even in terms of our consultation, who do we talk to based on where we see we haven't been able to make a lot of progress over the past few years, and how we bring that lens into our consultation process as well.
Thank you. Are there any other B?
I had a question about the new affordable rental home program. When I was at the old shelter, and then I got the email from the city for this program. So I applied. That's the first time I received it, so I applied. And then it's kind of like lottery, that kind of system. And I applied. I got drawn. With the lottery, I got drawn. So I made the second application, the actual application that's very complicated and detailed. And then But then they sent an email to me say, I'm not selected. I was wondering why I got drawn and I'm not selected. They didn't give me any reason, why I'm not, I don't get it, right? I didn't get the housing. So no explanation or the reason why I didn't get it. And then recently, and then after that, I still get a few from the city about the program of different area. So I didn't apply because the person I applied, I got drawn by the lottery, and then I didn't get it with the actual application. So recently, I think last week, the shelter counselor asked me to apply again. I was very hesitant, but I didn't want to say no, because if I said that, then she would say, I don't really uh, uh, um, give an effort to try. So I said, okay, I will do it. So I was wondering, like, for that kind of program, I think I did talk to Melanie about it, and Melanie said those lottery thing is by the agency, housing agent, some non-profit agency, and you have to be like kind of a member with that agency. They only you get it. Then I thought, then why then how do I know which agency own that in like own that let's say like they have it is recent one is Red Park at Mount Pleasant and Young. So how do I know which agency own that lottery? Like only 100 units. Most of the time it's 100. Sometimes it's like 85. And then I saw one co-op is like 20 something. They get some to the existing renter, people who live there, and then some new one to people who are new. So I'm wondering, how do we know that who own those affordable like only 100 units? So who own that 100 units? How do I approach? If that Melanie give me the answer is because I'm not in that member of that non-profit organization, housing organization, so I don't get it. But then how my question is, then in that case they should reject me in the first place, but I got drawn. But when I made my actual application, I didn't get the place. I cannot understand the reason behind it. But my thinking is that if I get drawn, for sure I will get the unit. Why I didn't get a unit? That's something until this moment I still cannot understand. Hope you can answer that, or maybe I don't know. You have to go and find out. Thank you.
Thank you, B.
So just very briefly, I can't really, unfortunately, speak to your specific inquiry. Again, if it's around access to RGI housing, there are phone numbers and contact information on the website that you can reach out to. Usually in the choice-based system for RGI housing, you would have the information around who owns the building that's being offered or it's available. But again, unfortunately, I can't speak to that individual inquiry that you have.
But I don't think that one is rent get to income. It's not the subsidy housing like like TCSC. That kind of is like RGI. But that kind of the one that by lottery thing is not RGI. I don't think it's RGI. RGI they don't do lottery system.
Yeah.
Your name the top, you will get it, right? But that kind of lottery system is another system. So I'm very confused about. I don't understand why with the lottery you got drawn, and then when you make the actual application, you don't get it.
Maybe this would be something that we can follow up directly with you after the meeting and get a little bit more information. I'm happy to ask my colleagues to follow up.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you, B. Thank you, Mercedes. Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Mercedes. So can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so just to piggyback on the conversation or the presentation that you've just shared, thank you for doing that, by the way. It was very informative. I think what I caught from that is the gaps, around the gaps that you mentioned. And just as, you talk about seniors, right? And women, for me, boldly put it, racialized people, right? Including those on the broad spectrum in the conversation. You've mentioned that OW rates have been stagnant for years, and we all know that. Because I've done my research around that. And as I ask this question, I'm thinking about people current income. I'm focusing more on marginalized population groups. You've mentioned in that same statement that the allocation from the city is not sufficient. So we know that there are problems. So the gaps are pretty obvious because there's just not enough money, right? But then I think about the HSF and HPP, which are designed to meet some of those objectives that you've mentioned earlier. So from that perspective there, I guess what I want to ask is, with OW being what it is, with these funds in place, how are we truly helping to assist marginalized and disadvantaged communities? Like, I hope I'm not asking you a question that you can't answer here.
I'll try my best to
Thank you.
respond. So again, this goes back to housing opportunities that are being made available across the housing continuum. So today, again, we spoke specifically about affordable rental homes, which is one portion of the housing continuum. We have the rent geared to income housing, which is the portfolio of Toronto Community Housing, as well as many nonprofit co-op organizations that operate rent geared to income housing, and this is our existing supply of homes. The new affordable rental homes are added on top of that to help kind of bridge some of that gap. We also have financial assistance that's being provided directly to renters. So COP, housing allowances, again, HPP, which is a homelessness prevention program, which is a provincial program that helps provide the city with housing and homelessness grants. Some of that goes into providing direct housing allowances to residents. So it's really a combination of all of these resources, not only from the city, but from other orders of government that are at play. And each of them have different priorities around, for example, helping Indigenous, Black and racialized, women, seniors. Some of them don't come with those specific targets or allocations. For example, the City of Toronto has an standing commitment to allocate 20% of its housing and homelessness grants to Indigenous-led housing solutions. So we work very closely with our Indigenous partners to ensure that 20% of our capital funding and operating funding goes towards improving housing outcomes for Indigenous communities. Again, those are and again, if we receive any federal funding, it will be the same. So we'll set aside 20% of that for Indigenous communities. So what I just really wanted to say, again, might not be a direct response to your question, is that we need to put all of these pieces together, right? But everywhere that we look, there is that gap. So when we're providing direct financial assistance, there is a gap. When we're building RGI housing, we just know that we haven't been building many RGI housing because we have not had the capital and operating funding that we used to have decades ago from other orders of government to enable us to build RGI housing. When we're building affordable rental housing, it's not going to be affordable to people with very low incomes, but it is bridging the gap for people who are still not able to rent a market rental unit in Toronto's expensive market. So I would encourage you to kind of look at it from that perspective of all of the channels and avenues that we are kind of following up to address the housing needs, not only just from the affordable rental housing supply perspective, but also from maintaining our existing supply of homes and helping people where they are.
Thank you. That was very useful. Thank you.
Great. So we do have two speakers to this item. Before we do that, I would like to put forward a motion that we extend the meeting to complete the agenda. It's 12:15. We should be finished by 12:30, but in the event that we go over 12:30, that we're able to continue. So the motion is to continue until we complete the agenda. Yes, Anne-Marie? Oh, you're moving. Okay, thank you.
Let's keep going.
And all in favor? Sorry, into the screen. When it's your turn, no, you don't get to ask questions. Only the committee does. You are then being called on to speak. Yes. Can I hold you? Can you just, we're in the middle of a motion. Please wait. Okay, so that was passed. Thank you. Carried. Now we have two speakers on the agenda for this item. And the first speaker is Jessica Pratazina. You will have 5 minutes, and I'll put the timer on.
Good afternoon. When my son was born, he was diagnosed with a congenital birth defect requiring several surgeries, ideally before he was 2 years old. Despite this, my family is still waiting over 3.5 years later with no end in sight, which has, as you can imagine, transformed our early years of parenting. Now, because I'm a researcher by profession, I wanted to understand more about how the hospital collected and analyzed the data about wait times. Following months of repeated attempts to engage in a protracted process, I learned that not only did I not know how long the wait might be, but neither did the department because no statistical data is collected. In fact, the hospital's IT system lacks the capability to perform even basic statistical analysis like calculating averages. I learned there's no hospital policy on data transparency, and I was finally and reluctantly told that the only data they had was that there were 68 of these surgeries performed in 2023, and my son is one of over 700 patients waiting. I'm telling you this so you know that data collection and analysis and transparency are not bureaucratic formalities. They are foundational to equitable service delivery and accountability. Like healthcare, housing is a right, which we've talked about quite a lot today, a fact that only seems debatable among those who have always had access to it. We know that women and gender diverse people experiencing violence often lack access to safe, affordable, stable housing, and this is one of the primary reasons why they might not leave an abusive living situation. In fact, it's the primary reason, that and financial. To support them, we need clear, unbiased data that's open and accessible to everyone. Open and transparent data collection and analysis is about making visible the people impacted by service gaps, allowing us to make informed, evidence-based decisions based not on personal feelings or political priorities or hunches, but on clear evidence of what is needed, where the issues lie, and how we can respond effectively. I've learned more than a few things in my 20-year career as a frontline worker, university instructor, and now as the education and research manager at Women Act, where I lead research and policy initiatives on ending gender-based violence and advancing housing rights for women and gender diverse people. Our work addresses the intersection of safe, affordable housing and IPV, advocating for policies that protect and empower those affected by violence. Early in my career, a social worker, an older colleague, told me that he worked under the assumption that about 25% of what he did was wrong, maybe even harmful, but he didn't know which 25%. You might believe that a policy or a program is helpful and it might be popular, but without the data to investigate, to evaluate, and understand, we don't know. Women Act is asking for 4 things today. 1, ensure that data is up to date and accurate and publicly accessible. Current dashboards and infographics lack clarity and fail to capture the experiences of women facing intimate partner violence or family violence. Publicly accessible raw data with relevant indicators identified in collaboration with the VAW sector and women with lived experience will provide the information needed to improve the housing system to meet their needs. 2, allow for collaborative analysis and interpretation of this data. Engaging diverse stakeholders, including local organizations and survivors, integrates the local knowledge that's essential to understanding the barriers faced by women experiencing violence. Collaborative analysis fosters shared ownership of these findings and strengthens recommendations for systems improvement. 3, increase transparency and data collection about housing. Communicate clearly how metrics were identified, what is being tracked, and the reasons and methods behind this. This transparency helps identify and reduce bias, creating a system that communities can trust and engage with. 4, set evidence-based, community-driven housing targets. Base targets on research and community needs, using data to identify and address service gaps directly. We don't do this to make ourselves feel good or to make our programs look successful. We do it so that women and their children waiting for housing know they're counted, that they count. For women experiencing violence, access to safe, affordable housing is life-changing. That's why it's crucial to build systems of transparency and integrity, where data isn't just numbers on a page, but a powerful tool to ensure that no one is left behind. With accurate, open data, we can address housing needs effectively, helping women and their families find stability and safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to open that up to the committee. Do any of the committees have questions for the speaker?
I don't have any questions, but I just want to say thank you so much for bringing that lens into the conversation, and even your work into it in understanding data, because I think data really, really matters in when we're looking at dealing with structural problems. Just like you said, like we need accurate and accessible data to help to inform the work that we're doing so we can have the proper outcomes and help the people who are really needing the help, so no one gets left behind. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Harmy?
Yes, to second Anne-Marie and add to her point, thank you, Jessica, for your deputation today. And just to add that as a committee member, and I said it earlier, it's important to me to be able to have the information in order to do this work as a committee member, to oversee. It's one of the duties that we have. And so thank you for bringing to light how important that is.
I just want to echo that. Thank you. And I think you raised points that we're also concerned with as it relates to a human rights approach. And as we go into this opportunity for collecting the right data, collecting it the right way, interpreting it, those are all really helpful. Thank you very much. And we have a second speaker on this item, Carrie Ann.
Remembrance Month. I'm also a founder of an organization called Black Veteran Affairs, so I just want to take my moment in this session just to give recognition to those that have and continue to serve our Canadian Armed Forces and here and overseas, and those that have been deceased, and just want to give that acknowledgement for those who continue to fight for us every day. That being said, on the topic, the young lady speaking, thank you for the work that you're doing out there. It's magnificent. I was at church yesterday. I met a woman who was actually dealing with domestic abuse and what she had experienced. So that was really very touching. Thank you. However, we'll get back to the recommendations again. You brought us some very good questions. You did as well, Anne-Marie. And the question pertaining to this is why we're failing the women and racialized communities, Indigenous, I call it melanin Indigenous nations, as well as gender-based individuals. We're also wondering why are we, the data, why is it falling behind so much? What do we need to get accurate information? And this is once again going back to something that I've discovered in the beginning when I first spoke. And it is the background information that seems to be silent triggers that are creating ripple effects or domino effects that are bringing on these questions, lack of data that are not measurable because it's not there placed within the framework to be measured, which is why the urgency for the recommendation mentioned previously, to see how this could correlate to some of the things that are being mentioned by many of the speakers that are here today and many of the issues that are being presented, which includes limited housing, which then I would like to leave with you. We also do consulting, well I do, a mix of public relations, community outreach as a community expert through my company, Cat Brand Inc. And so I'm hoping possibly in the future, the young lady, Mercedes, that was here, when she's doing independent assessment, she'd be willing to outreach to groups and new groups within the community that could bring forth new information that can add to the questions of why we're not doing so well and why the data and the ways in which we can assess and measure the data and its impact, if we can start to look at new baselines that we could use as a means to figure what this could be. And continuing, I'd like to ask Councillor Carroll, there was a letter that was presented in regards to the human rights indicators and human rights assessment. Many of these cases that are being reported to my community group with the Reset community is being seen as human rights violations. Many of them have been brought to the United Nations through the international law. Many are coming out of the US as well, where they feel like there is a heavy threat. And so I'd like to really ask if she'd be willing and place a recommendation under where the Indigenous have presented, especially with the treaty, how we, the community of the Caribbean and African descent, especially with our acknowledgement and rights, 1600 and beyond, through what we have experienced, and how we can be part of that letter that's there, that's being tabled, that Mr. Gord has asked to be set aside, because the same thing that was indicated in that letter is exactly, if I could have worded it like that, I would have. And therefore, I will just like to ask that we be attached, if we can, with the Indigenous communities that you have spoken to, let them know about our groups and see how the same human rights that we're expecting to find solutions to, it can be tabled under and attached with that letter that will be mentioned with the executive committee, which is really one of the recommendations I'd like to have tabled as well. And with Mercedes, who spoke in regards to getting the accurate data that she needs, we're hoping that you'll be willing to outreach to new groups like ours that can present something new to the table that will bring more outlook and provide possibly some answers to the many questions that many of you are inquiring. Our report shows that a lot of the ripple effect is falling into each of the lanes of the questions of which you're speaking about, and it is affecting the human rights and of the individuals in these communities of melanin Indigenous nations, women-led households predominantly, and as well gender-based. And this is where I would like to leave it there, to see that you could actually take some of these recommendations which I earlier presented, and that is doing a cross-reference check. It does also consider as to what's happening with the mental health diseases, illnesses, hospitals, and just across the board, which is why I've asked for this consideration to be taken seriously on how we could do a cross-reference scan across the various boards and agencies, commissions, and industries, and correlated with the various municipal governments, along with the Indigenous groups. We'd like to see a cooperation between those of us, especially under the United Nations Declaration for us, and with the Indigenous and those with the treaties, and how or where there might be correlations and connections. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie Ann. And just to clarify, I'm not a councillor. My name is Elizabeth McIsaac, and I'm the chair of this committee.
Sorry, Elizabeth. Thank you. You look similar to Carol. I've been mistaking you, so.
That's okay.
Thank you.
And also to clarify that we don't have the authority to call for reviews of things. This is an advisory committee on housing as a human right. So I appreciate your call for action on those items, and I think that they're important calls, but it's not within the actual mandate of this committee to be able to do that. So, but I just want to hear you loud and clear, so thank you.
That really does help, which then I would ask that as the advisory committee to housing, which was just formed last year, you could put forward these recommendations to those whose purvey it falls under this advisory board.
Thank you.
So thanks for clarifying those steps for me, but it's still, as an advisory committee for housing, this as a new committee is something that would be vital to make all of your effective skills, backgrounds, and expertise be put to good use, so that the results and all the main questions on why is it failing, what can be done, where are the measurables, where are the data, you would really be putting all of your expertise to good use with this recommendation through your advisory committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions of the committee to this speaker? Seeing none, thank you very much. And I would now ask to move to receive the item for information from the city staff on the progress report and the evaluation forthcoming. Thank you, Bahar. And all in favor, seeing hands go up. Are we in favor, Anne-Marie? Oh, sorry. I looked over. So carried. Thank you very much. And so that brings us back to the first item, which is actually the last item, which is item number 7. And I believe that we now have a reformatted. We are not putting forward a motion to the executive committee, but rather that the Housing Rights Advisory Committee confirm its support of the following. The statement has not changed. It's just the form of what will go forward. And it is, I will read it again. Housing Rights Advisory Committee is seriously concerned with the proposal by mayors in Ontario and the Premier of Ontario to invoke the notwithstanding clause in order to override the charter rights of individuals who are unhoused and unsheltered in Ontario cities by clearing encampments, imposing involuntary treatment, and incarceration for repeated trespass. This contravenes our commitments under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It fundamentally opposes the right to life and security of the person as protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and is inconsistent with the National Housing Strategy Act. The Housing Rights Advisory Committee strongly encourages the City of Toronto to continue its work and commitment under the Toronto Housing Charter to realize the right to housing for every resident in this city. So that is the motion. Can I see a vote in favor? Or do I have to ask questions first? No, we're good. Anyone has questions? We're good. All in favor, show of hands. And
Just if I may say something to it.
please say something, Gord.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that the members of the committee were aware. Mayor Chow did not sign this letter. She was invited to and refused. She has put out a statement saying that the notwithstanding clause isn't a solution. It will not create more housing or more shelter spaces. It doesn't matter if you have the legal ability to remove people from encampment if they have nowhere to go. There are several real actions the province could take to resolve encampments and end homelessness, including supporting, creating more supportive housing, providing more rent supplements, raising social assistance rates, reinstating rent control, and more mental health and addiction support. These would help people experiencing homelessness get back on their feet rather than shuffling them from park to park.
Thank you, Gord. I think that's really important for us to hear, and I'm proud of our mayor for taking that position. She also made a very positive statement when the first statement of mayors came out about 2 weeks ago, and so we encourage to stay in that line. Thank you very much. So with that, we now are in the last item for what? Motion carried. Everyone voted, and it was motion carried. And now we need to adopt the item as amended. Moved by Bahar. Do we just have to vote? Yes. Show of hands. And we are adopted. At some point, I'm going to know all these rules, but just not yet. Okay, thank you very much. And so we're now at the end of the meeting. I need to have, if I could ask someone please to move the motion to excuse the absence of the members not in attendance today. We were missing Joy. Thank you, Harmy. All in favor? Hands up. We're good. Thank you very much. That is carried, and that concludes our business for today. Thank you to everyone for participating. Our next meeting is on Thursday, February the 6th, 2025. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for all your work on this committee. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I made you really work this morning.